Snow drifted across the open prairie in languid spirals, as if the wind itself had slowed to witness the fragile silhouette moving along the road. Evening light, thin, trembling, spread over the plains in a dusty orange glow, the kind that made every memory feel older than it truly was. Caleb Rourke rode with his hat pulled low, coat stiff from the cold, his horse's steady rhythm beating like a tired heart against the barren land. He was heading home before the night froze the world solid, when he saw her, a lone figure walking, steps unsteady, arms wrapped around a threadbare coat that barely trapped the breath in her chest. At first he assumed it was a mirage brought on by fatigue, some wandering soul of winter shaped by wind and regret. But as he drew nearer, he saw the truth. A young Chinese woman, thin from hunger, hair tangled by the long road, her face lowered as if the snow itself might judge her. Caleb reined in beside her. She did not look up immediately. She seemed afraid her gaze might burden him, or worse, provoke him. The wind pressed her coat against her body, revealing the angles of someone who had learned to survive instead of live. He cleared his throat, gentle despite his broad frame. "Ma'am, it's a long walk to anywhere from here." Her breath shivered out in a half-cloud. When she finally lifted her face, her eyes were rimmed with exhaustion, yet held a fragile dignity that had somehow refused to break. Her voice, soft, almost brittle, traveled only a few inches before the wind caught it. "Can you take me to town?" Something tightened in Caleb's chest, the kind of tightening he hadn't felt since he buried his father and inherited a ranch he never wanted to be alone in. Most folks avoided strangers on this road, especially strangers who looked like her. Foreign, quiet, too graceful for a land carved by harsh winters and harsher tongues. But there was something in her request that did not sound like a plea for help. It sounded like someone asking for permission to keep hope alive. He nodded once, steady as the earth beneath his boots. "I can. But only if you promise to come back home." She blinked, confused, her lips parting slightly. "Home? My ranch," he clarified, though even he didn't know why the words came so easily. Maybe because she looked like someone who had been turned away from too many doors. Maybe because he remembered what loneliness felt like when it had no witness. His voice softened. "At least until the cold eases." Li Mei, though he didn't know her name yet, hesitated, her fingers trembling at her side as if weighing the danger of accepting kindness. Then, with a small, trembling nod, she allowed him to take her hand and help her onto the horse. She sat lightly behind him, careful not to lean too close, careful not to take up more space than she felt allowed. They rode in silence toward town, snow whispering around them. Caleb kept his posture steady, aware of how fragile she felt, how her breath shook each time the wind cut across the prairie. She was cold, colder than she let herself admit, but she held her spine with a quiet pride that stirred something long asleep in him. When they entered town, the reaction was instant. Heads turned. Doors cracked open. Whispers spread like sparks through dry grass. Caleb watched her shrink inward, shoulders folding as if she wished she could disappear into the seams of her coat. The weight of judgment in the air was heavy, cruel, familiar. He'd felt it himself once, when folks labeled him strange, silent, unfit for company. But she bore a heavier burden. She was a foreign woman in a land that decided too quickly who belonged and who did not. A group of women near the mercantile stared openly, their expressions sharp as needles. One whispered, "Who's that with Caleb Rourke?" Another muttered, "He's bringing trouble home, you mark my words." A man outside the saloon spat at the dirt and smirked. Li Mei's fingers tightened against the saddle. Her breathing turned shallow. Caleb's jaw worked, the muscle near his temple tightening. He reached back just enough to shift his hand so it shielded her from the worst of the wind, and the eyes. It was a tiny gesture, barely noticeable, but her breath steadied a little. He led her to the general store, where the warmth inside carried the scent of pine and kerosene. She stood near the doorway while he gathered supplies, her gaze fixed on the floorboards as if they alone were safe to look at. Every creak of a wooden plank, every shuffle of a stranger's boot, made her flinch. He purchased what he needed quickly, aware of how exposed she felt. When they stepped outside, snow had begun to fall thicker, each flake catching the lamplight like a fading star. She reached into her coat, withdrawing a small coin. "For the ride," she whispered, offering it with both hands, an act of deep respect in her culture, though few here would recognize it. Caleb shook his head, pushing her hands gently back toward her chest. "You don't owe me for taking you where you needed to go." Her eyes widened, the faintest tremor of disbelief crossing her face. She was used to owing, used to paying in ways no one should. He saw it in the way her shoulders carried invisible weight. They left town as night settled, the cold deepening. She spoke only once, voice barely above the wind. "Why offer your home to a stranger?" Caleb kept his eyes on the horizon, where his ranch lights flickered faintly like lanterns guiding a wanderer back from the world's edge. Strangers see a man truer than the people who think they know him. She didn't answer, but he heard her breath catch, a soft, startled sound, as if someone had cracked open a door inside her and light touched a place long dark. As they neared the ranch, the snow thickened into a swirling curtain, obscuring the world beyond a few feet. Li Mei tightened her grip on the saddle, fear slipping through her calm. Caleb slowed the horse. "Easy," he murmured. "Storm's just talking." A gust of wind roared across the prairie, bending the grass and rattling the old fence. Li Mei pressed closer, not out of fear of him, but fear of being swallowed by the storm. Caleb glanced back, meeting her eyes for the first time since they left town. In that moment, he realized something unsettlingly clear. This woman was not merely lost on the road. She was running from something, something that would not let her rest, even now. And whatever it was, it had followed her into the storm. Morning crept over the ranch with a pale, milk-blue light, stretching itself across the frosted fields as if hesitant to disturb the quiet. Li Mei woke to the faint creak of wood settling and the distant call of a lone rooster greeting the day. For a moment she didn't know where she was. The walls were warm instead of cold, the air still instead of hostile, and the silence, kind. She sat up slowly on the cot Caleb had prepared for her, clutching the thin quilt to her chest as if it were the only certainty she possessed. The events of the night returned to her in fragments. The snowstorm, the whispers in town, the rancher who had offered her shelter without demanding anything in return. A man like that felt impossible. Caleb was already outside when she stepped onto the porch, boots crunching on the thin layer of frost. He worked with the calm precision of someone who understood the land's temperament, pitching hay, checking the fence line, murmuring instructions to the horses with a gentleness that didn't match his broad shoulders. He glanced up when he sensed her presence. He didn't stare or ask questions, just nodded once, acknowledging her without overwhelming her. It was a kind of mercy she hadn't known existed. "You warm enough?" he asked, his breath fogging the air between them. She nodded. Words often felt like fragile guests in her throat, and she rarely invited them out unless necessary. Caleb didn't push. He simply pointed toward the barn. "I'm heading to town today. Got to deal with some paperwork. If you still want to go, ride with me. If not, you can stay here. No pressure either way." Town. That word still held weight, sharp, bitter, and heavy with a memory of the eyes that had followed her like shadows. She hesitated, fingers curling tightly into her sleeves. There was something she needed in town. Something taken from her by a man who believed he owned her fate. Fear told her to stay at the ranch, where the walls didn't whisper. Courage told her to reclaim what was hers. "I will go," she said softly. Caleb saddled the horse while she wrapped herself in the coat he'd offered. It was far too big for her, swallowing her slight figure, but she wore it gratefully. Riding into town felt different today. The sky was clearer, the cold sharper, the feeling in her chest heavier. She expected Caleb to speak along the way, ask her who she was or where she came from, but he didn't. He seemed to understand that silence was its own form of healing. When they reached town, the stares returned, quick, cutting, assessing. People paused mid-step. A few tilted their heads, whispering into gloved hands. Li Mei kept her gaze low, but she felt every glance like a spark against her skin. Caleb walked beside her, slow and steady, his presence a quiet shield. Martha Callens, the seamstress who knew more about people than the sheriff ever could, stood in her doorway with a basket of mended shirts. Her eyes narrowed as she studied Li Mei. "Caleb Rourke," she called, voice carrying across the street. "You're surprising folks more every day." Caleb tipped his hat politely. "Morning, ma'am." "And morning to you," she said, directing her gaze pointedly at Li Mei. "I hear you brought home company." There was no malice in her tone, only curiosity sharpened by a lifetime of watching hearts break and mend in this dusty place. "Strangers don't stay strangers for long around here." Li Mei bowed slightly out of habit, a gesture that only confused Martha further. Caleb stepped in subtly, shifting the conversation. "We won't keep you, ma'am. But the damage was done." Curious faces peeked through windows, wondering who the foreign woman was and what business she had with the quiet rancher who'd kept mostly to himself since his father passed. Whisper threads wove between the buildings, thin but powerful. Li Mei entered the general store with Caleb. The warmth inside spread through her limbs like a slow exhale. Amos Briggs, the sheriff, stood near the counter speaking with the shopkeeper. He looked up, his expression shifting from neutral to wary. "Caleb," he greeted, then nodded at Li Mei. "Ma'am." Her body stiffened. She knew that voice. It belonged to a man entrusted with order. And order, in her past, had always served those who oppressed her. Caleb collected his goods, paying quickly. The sheriff approached, lowering his voice. "Word is Turner's back in town." Li Mei froze. Caleb's hand paused mid-reach. Amos continued, his gaze flicking between them. "He's been asking questions. Claims the girl owes him. Says she left without permission." Caleb's jaw clenched. "She doesn't owe him a damn thing." Amos sighed. "I didn't say I believed him. But Turner has a way of convincing folks who don't know better. You should both be careful." Li Mei felt the room tilt slightly. Memories of Turner's harsh commands, withheld wages, and cruel expectations scraped against her thoughts like rusted metal. She had worked for him because she had no choice. He had fed her only enough to keep her upright. And when she finally escaped, she took nothing but her courage, and even that felt stolen some days. "I came here for something he took," she whispered. Caleb looked at her. Not with surprise, but with a quiet question. "What?" She hesitated, then answered, "A small box. My mother's hairpin is inside." The sheriff bowed his head. "I'll keep an eye on Turner, but he's angry. Be ready." As they stepped back into the street, the winter sun seemed dimmer, the whispers louder, the world narrower. Caleb walked slightly ahead, carving a path through the crowd without touching her, without urging her, simply allowing her to follow at her own pace. It was a subtle kindness, but she felt it deeply. Outside the saddle shop, Li Mei stopped abruptly, a tremor in her breath. Caleb turned. "Something wrong." She swallowed hard, her voice barely audible. "If he finds me, he'll take me back." Caleb's expression shifted, softening and hardening at once, like iron heated then cooled. "Not while I'm breathing." His words wrapped around her like a promise she wasn't sure she deserved. As they mounted the horse again, a figure stepped out from between two buildings, a tall man with a familiar, predatory stillness. Elias Turner watched them with a thin smile, his eyes cold as polished stone. Li Mei's heart faltered. Caleb's grip tightened on the reins. Turner's voice slid across the street like a blade. "Found you." And the world seemed to stop breathing. The moment Elias Turner's eyes locked on Li Mei, she felt the cold in her bones deepen into something sharper than winter. Caleb shifted subtly in the saddle, placing himself between her and the man who had once owned every hour of her life. Turner's smile, thin and curved like a cruel hook, didn't match the simmering anger beneath it. The street quieted around him, townsfolk pretending not to watch while missing nothing. "Well now," Turner drawled, hands tucked into his coat pockets. "Didn't expect you to wander off with the first man fool enough to pick you up off the road." His gaze flicked to Caleb. "You planning to return my property, Rourke?" Li Mei flinched. Caleb did not. "She's no man's property," Caleb said, voice low, steady. "And certainly not yours." Turner laughed, too loudly for the silence around them. "You think I took her in for charity? She owes me. Work. Wages. Debt." He stepped closer. "A debt she doesn't get to walk away from." Li Mei's fingers curled into the saddle as if gripping her own breath. Caleb felt a tremor through the leather, and his jaw tightened. She owes you nothing. Turner's eyes narrowed. You're making this your business? Looks like it already is. A ripple moved through the street, an exchanged glance, a held breath, a fear of what might follow. Turner took a single step forward, but his voice dropped into something colder than the air. She'll come back one way or another. You can't protect someone who doesn't belong here. The words struck Li Mei deeper than he intended. The ache they stirred wasn't new. It lived inside her, carved by years of being told she was foreign, lesser, temporary. Something in her chest folded inward, and that subtle collapse did more to ignite Caleb's anger than Turner's threats ever could. Caleb maneuvered the horse away from him and didn't look back. Turner didn't follow, but his voice carried across the snow-dusted street. You're only delaying the inevitable. The words echoed long after he disappeared behind a building. Li Mei's breaths grew shallow. Caleb kept the horse steady, riding out of town as the clouds thickened into dense gray curtains overhead. Snowflakes drifted slowly, heavy enough to fall rather than float. She held herself rigidly upright until they reached the open prairie, where the noise of town dissolved into wind and distant birdsong. She whispered, I am sorry. Caleb slowed the horse. For what? For bringing trouble to you. You didn't bring it. Trouble belongs to the man who made it. She lowered her head. He is cruel. When I worked for him, every day, I wondered if kindness was something only other people had. Caleb did not turn around, but she heard the grief in his silence. You deserved better. Everyone does. Her next words trembled. He took something of mine. Something small. Something from my mother. A box. I came to town because I hoped maybe he still had it. She hesitated. It is all I have left. Caleb nodded, as if absorbing her confession with the gentleness of a man who understood loss intimately. We'll figure it out. They reached the ranch just as sunlight broke through the clouds, painting the snow in soft gold. The horses lifted their heads, steam rising from their breath. She dismounted carefully, her legs weak from the tension inside her body. Caleb steadied her, his touch brief and respectful, like he was afraid to break the fragile way she held herself together. Inside the house, warmth wrapped around her like a quilt she didn't deserve. Caleb busied himself by stoking the fire, not looking at her but offering the comfort of his presence. She found a place near the window, where light spilled across the wooden floor in bright slants. Her hands shook as she unwound her scarf. Town will talk, Caleb said quietly, settling into a chair. They always do. I am used to whispers, she replied softly. What frightens me is that he will come here. That he will demand I return. Caleb studied her, the lamplight softening the hard lines of his face. If he comes here, he'll answer to me. He said it simply, not as a boast or threat, but as a fact shaped by the weight of who he was. Li Mei felt warmth spread inside her, a sensation unfamiliar and frightening in its tenderness. Why? She asked. Why stand beside me? Caleb leaned back, eyes drifting to the fire. Because I know what it feels like to have no one stand beside you. His voice carried an old ache, one that had settled deep in him. He didn't explain further, but she sensed the truth. Loneliness had carved him as sharply as hardship had carved her. They ate dinner quietly. She prepared it, hands steadying with each movement, finding a strange comfort in the rhythm of chopping vegetables and stirring broth. Caleb watched without intruding, noticing how she checked the corners of the room, how she listened for sounds outside even when none existed. When night fell, the wind sharpened. Snow drummed against the roof as if urging the world awake. Caleb checked the doors twice, then glanced toward her cot. She sat beside it, blanket in her lap, eyes far away. You should sleep, he murmured. I may not be able to, she admitted. He nodded, understanding the ghosts that kept people awake. After a moment, he spoke again. You're safe here, Li Mei. Her name sounded gentler in his voice than it ever had in her own memory. She clutched the blanket tighter, and something inside her shifted, a cautious trust, small but growing. Caleb stepped outside for his nightly rounds. The cold bit into him, sharp and alerting. He scanned the tree line, the horizon, the dark corners where danger could hide. Everything was quiet, but the quiet felt strained, stretched thin. He returned to the porch to check the latch on the gate when he noticed something in the snow. Footprints. Not his. Not hers. Fresh. Leading toward the barn, then circling back toward the road. His stomach tightened. Someone had been near the house while they were inside. Inside, Li Mei lay awake, staring at the rafters, unaware of the tracks outside the door. Caleb brushed snow from his coat, jaw clenched, and stepped inside. He paused, watching her exhale softly. She seemed peaceful for a moment. But the peace was a lie. Turner was closer than she realized. And his footprints were already fading beneath the falling snow. Caleb didn't sleep that night. Not because the wind howled against the window panes or because the storm kept loosening shingles on the roof, but because each time he closed his eyes, he saw those footprints, fresh, circling, deliberate. Someone had come close enough to touch the barn, close enough to hear the soft crackle of the fire inside the house, close enough to watch them. At dawn, he stepped outside again, lantern in hand, scanning the yard with narrowed eyes. The snow had drifted through the night, covering most of the prints, but faint impressions remained near the fence line, half erased by wind. Caleb followed them only far enough to see the direction they pointed, toward town. Toward Turner. His jaw set like stone. Inside, Li Mei stirred awake. Her gaze drifted to Caleb's coat, still dusted with snow. "You were out long," she murmured. "Checking things," he said. Storm made a mess of the yard. But she studied him too closely for him to hide the truth. Fear flickered in her eyes, a quiet haunting. He was here. Caleb didn't answer. Silence told her everything. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, the fragile threads lifting in the faint breeze. "I should leave," she whispered. "If I stay, he'll hurt you." "Leaving won't stop him," Caleb replied softly. "You running only makes him chase harder. Men like Turner feed on fear." She looked out the window, to the vast snow-covered land where she had wandered alone before Caleb found her. That road had nearly swallowed her. She didn't know if she had the strength to walk it again. "I don't want to bring ruin to your home. You've brought nothing but life back into it," he said before he could stop himself. Color warmed his cheeks, but he didn't look away. "This place was quiet in all the wrong ways before you." Her lips parted, the faintest ghost of astonishment crossing them. She lowered her gaze, but a different kind of trembling moved through her now, something softer, deeper, more human than fear. They spent the morning in uneasy quiet. Li Mei helped mend a saddle strap while Caleb chopped wood, each of them glancing toward the road as if expecting Turner to materialize from the swirling frost. The storm had calmed, but the air held that charged stillness of a world waiting. Around noon, a distant sound cracked through the cold, a horse approaching at speed. Caleb stiffened, axe freezing mid-swing. Li Mei felt the blood drain from her face. The hoofbeats grew louder until a rider burst into view. Sheriff Amos Briggs, snow caked to his coat, face flushed from urgency. Caleb dropped the axe and strode forward. "What happened?" The sheriff dismounted, breath heavy. "Turner came to the office this morning, raising hell. Claims the girl stole from him. Claims you're harboring her. Says he's got witnesses." Li Mei's hands shook around the saddle strap. "Witnesses?" she whispered. She knew he had none. But lies sometimes carried louder voices than truth. Amos continued, "I've called a hearing. Thought you'd want to be there. And you," he turned to Li Mei, his tone softening, "should tell your side before Turner poisons the whole room." Caleb's voice hardened. "She'll tell her side. And I'll be there." Li Mei hesitated, breath trembling. The thought of facing Turner again made her ribs feel too small for her heart. But running had only kept her trapped. Maybe confronting him was the only way to break the chain he kept tightening around her. "I will go," she said, voice quiet but steady. They saddled the horse and rode together toward town, the sheriff leading. Li Mei held onto the saddle pommel, her fingers pale from the cold and fear. Caleb rode stiffly, scanning every shadow as though danger hid in them all. The town looked different today, less curious, more expectant. Folks had gathered outside the sheriff's office, coats pulled tight, breath swirling in the icy air. Whispers rose like steam. There she is. Turner's furious. Rourke's a fool for getting involved. Caleb dismounted first and helped Li Mei down, his touch warm through her gloves. She let herself lean into that warmth for one heartbeat before stepping away, gathering what courage she could. Inside the office, Turner stood with an air of triumph, arms folded, grin sharp enough to cut skin. "Took you long enough," he said. "I was starting to think you'd hide behind your rancher forever." Caleb stepped forward. "Watch your mouth." Sheriff Briggs raised a hand. "Enough. Let's keep this civil. Turner, state your claim." Turner launched into a performance, pacing, gesturing, weaving lies with the ease of a man who had spent his life bending truth to suit his whims. He spoke of contracts she never signed, debts she never owed, work she supposedly abandoned. Every accusation struck Li Mei like a blow, but she stood firm, hands clasped in front of her. When he was done, the sheriff turned to her. "Miss, your turn." Li Mei swallowed, her voice emerging low but clear. "I worked for him to survive. He paid me barely enough to live. When I became sick, he threatened to throw me out. When I found strength to leave, he called it betrayal." Her throat thickened. "I took nothing from him. He took from me." Turner scoffed. "Lies." But her next words silenced even him. "He took a box belonging to my mother. It is the only thing I have left of her." A shift moved through the room, small but powerful. Caleb stepped closer, a quiet affirmation of her truth. Sheriff Briggs exhaled. "I've heard enough. Until further evidence is shown, she stays free. Turner, you leave her be." Turner's face twisted. "This isn't over." He brushed past Caleb on his way out, muttering something venomous. Caleb didn't react, but his eyes darkened. As the townsfolk began to disperse, Li Mei's legs weakened. Caleb caught her arm gently. "You did good," he murmured. But she wasn't listening to him. Her gaze had fixed on something across the room. Turner had dropped a slip of fabric when he stormed out. A small torn square, embroidered with golden thread she recognized instantly. It was from her mother's box. Her breath stilled. He still had it. And he wasn't going to give it back. Not willingly. Snow fell heavier on the ride back to the ranch, as though the sky itself wished to veil the world before the truth tore it open. Li Mei held the torn piece of embroidered fabric in her hands, her thumb tracing the golden thread that once belonged to a boxer mother packed with care and hope. This small scrap felt like a heartbeat, stubborn and alive. Caleb rode beside her in tense silence, the kind that gathered weight with each gust of winter wind. When they reached the porch, he finally spoke. "He has the box." She nodded, unable to form words. The wind caught her hair, twisting it around her face like strands of ink. Caleb watched her carefully. "We'll get it," he said, steady as an oath. "Whatever it takes." Fear flickered through her. "I don't want you hurt because of me." Her voice held the brittle ache of someone who had always paid dearly for the smallest kindness. Caleb stepped closer, gently taking the fabric from her trembling hands. "I'm already involved. Not because you brought trouble, Li Mei. Because you brought meaning." His voice softened. "Let me stand for you." Her breath caught, something between disbelief and gratitude. She looked away, tears burning the corners of her eyes. Before she could speak, a distant crack split the air, sharp, metallic, unnatural. Caleb's head snapped up. Another crack followed, echoing across the frozen fields. Gunshots. He moved instantly. "Stay inside," he ordered, his voice low, protective. But Li Mei reached for his coat, her fingers cold and desperate. "Please don't go alone." "I'm not leaving you," he said, brushing her hand gently, "but I need to know what's out there." Fear pressed into her chest as she watched him step into the snow. The world seemed to hold its breath. She pressed herself against the doorway, straining to hear anything beyond the moaning wind. A shadow emerged at the edge of the barn. Then another. Figures, 2, maybe 3, approaching with hostile purpose. Turner's men. Their boots crunched through the snow with a slow confidence that made Li Mei's stomach twist. Caleb positioned himself between them and the house, shoulders squared. "You shouldn't be here," he said, voice carrying the weight of warning. One man smirked, shifting his rifle. "We're here for the girl. Turner wants what's his." Caleb didn't flinch. "She's not his." The second man spat into the snow. "Then he wants the box, and he wants her gone." The words lit something fierce inside Li Mei. Gone. That was how the world had treated her for so long, as something to discard, erase, forget. She stepped out despite Caleb's raised hand. "I am not going back," she said, her voice trembling but unbroken. The men laughed, but the sound died when Caleb stepped forward, blocking their view of her. "You heard her." A rifle lifted. Time stretched thin as ice. Caleb reacted before the man could pull the trigger. He lunged, knocking the barrel aside. A gunshot ripped through the air, wild and harmless. Snow exploded upward like white fire. Li Mei gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The second man charged, striking Caleb in the jaw. Caleb stumbled, then tackled him, sending both crashing into the snow. Li Mei's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum. She had lived through fear before, but this risk taken for her, felt unbearable. The first man regained balance, raising his rifle again, aiming at Caleb's back. Li Mei cried out, "Stop!" The man ignored her. Caleb didn't see the barrel shifting toward him. The world narrowed, a single thread of choice stretching before her. She ran, feet slipping, breath burning, placing herself between the rifle and Caleb just as the trigger tightened. The shot never came. Sheriff Briggs's voice thundered across the field. "Drop it!" He and 2 deputies emerged from behind the trees, guns drawn. The hired men froze. Within seconds, rifles clattered into the snow. Caleb pulled himself upright, breath ragged, eyes flicking immediately to Li Mei. Sheriff Briggs approached fast. "Turner sent these fools to do his dirty work. He'll answer for it." The deputies restrained the men. The sheriff stepped closer to Li Mei. "You all right, ma'am?" She nodded, though her knees trembled. "I am now." Caleb reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. Their fingers intertwined, fragile but certain. He brushed a thumb across the back of her hand, soft as breath. "You shouldn't have run toward danger," he murmured. She looked up at him, eyes shimmering like thawing lakes. "You taught me not to run." Emotion flickered across Caleb's face, raw, unguarded. He squeezed her hand gently and helped her back toward the house while the sheriff prepared to ride into town to arrest Turner himself. Inside, warm light wrapped around them again. For a long moment neither spoke. The wind outside moaned against the windows, but it no longer sounded threatening. It sounded hollow, weakened. Caleb finally broke the silence. "We'll get your mother's box back. I promise." Li Mei touched the fabric scrap, now resting on the table. "I don't want the past to chain me anymore," she whispered. "But that box, it is the last part of her. I cannot let him keep it." "And he won't," Caleb said. She lifted her gaze, meeting his fully. "Why do you fight for me this way?" He exhaled slowly, as if the answer had waited inside him for years. "Because you found a home here long before you asked for one." Her breath trembled, a soft, luminous sound. Outside, the sheriff's lantern bobbed through the darkness as he rode away, carrying justice toward town. The world felt shifted, realigned. For the first time, Li Mei felt herself anchored, not by fear, but by choice. Yet the final blow of the night had not yet struck. As Caleb closed the door, a scrap of paper slid from beneath it, caught between the boards. He bent, lifted it, unfolded it. Li Mei saw his expression change. Shock first, then anger sharpened to steel. She stepped closer. "What is it?" Caleb handed her the note. In Turner's cruel handwriting, 5 chilling words stretched across the page. You'll both pay for this.